everybody. Welcome to Cosmic Connections. I'm Starlene. I'm here with Faye and Christopher, and we have today with us Demetra George. Demetra is going to be one of the speakers at the Cosmic Patterns Conference. That is March 7 through 9 in 2025, so next year. We're really excited to talk to Demetra today. She's going to be giving one of the pre-conference lectures, and she's also going to be doing a workshop. So we're excited to talk about that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Demetra.
Yes, Starlene and Christopher and Faye. So I'm so looking forward to gathering with everyone in Florida and having the opportunity for astrologers to be together in person. So I'm grateful for all that you're doing to facilitate that for our community.
Thank you for being part of it. Yeah, thank you so much for being part of it. It's exciting to be able to learn from you and all the others as well. And also, thank you for being on our podcast too. So, Demetra, I want to ask you a question I've asked most of the speakers. How did you get into astrology? What was the thing, or was there a moment or a story that you can tell us about how you got into astrology? What sparked that in you?
Well, my first awareness that astrology was something that could be studied was when I was thinking maybe a sophomore in college. And I became aware of a clique of older juniors and seniors who I heard, and I was in a school that was about 100 miles north of New York City in New York State. And every week they would drive into the city and take an astrology class with someone who would also feed them dinner during the class. And I thought that was like so exotic. It wasn't until several years later, maybe 3-4 years later, that I was living in a community in Southern Oregon after I left college with many of my college friends. And there was a library of many metaphysical books, including astrology and tarot and numerology and the Eastern teachings of Krishnamurti and Yogananda and all of that we were living a very back to the land. This is 1970, simple life in the woods, but we were having all of these metaphysical discussions about these topics. And after maybe the first year, I like to joke, the first year my progress moon was in Taurus, and I spent the winter crocheting Afghans and doing all this handwork. And then the progress moon went into Gemini, and I said, I'm going to go stark raving mad if I have to spend another winter crocheting. So, so then there are some astrology books there, and I said, I think I'm going to learn to cast a chart. So I picked up Llewellyn George's ABC Horoscope Maker, and 3 days later, I could cast a chart, and I started doing the charts of the people in the community, and it began. And that's how that began.
Wow. That's a lovely story, and it's so cool that when it captures you and you just go with it.
No, and then 2 years later, I went to my first astrology conference, and where I didn't know anybody, and this friendly-looking woman in the lobby, waiting for the doors to open, I sort of slided up to so I wouldn't feel so isolated, and that turned out to be Eleanor Bach, who had just published the first asteroid ephemeris, that she had brand new copies in her bag. And she was the teacher that my college friends had been going to study with, unbeknown to me that all of that unfolded in that moment. So I thought it was fascinating how, the threads of our fate can appear years before we actually see the picture of the tapestry that's being woven around our life. So that was in California. So I was in New York. I heard about her. I met her in California. She gave me the asteroid book because she found that my name Demetra was equivalent to Ceres, the asteroid that she was most interested in. She looked it up. She saw it was opposite my sun, and she gave me the book. So that's how the astrology started, and that's how the asteroids began. So that was between, well, I met Eleanor in 1973. I started studying astrology September of 71, and it was maybe 3 years earlier that I first heard about this astrologer woman in New York.
Wow, that's a beautiful story. I loved hearing it. And you have since written many books, starting with Asteroid Goddess all the way to present moment, the ancient astrology in theory and practice, volumes 1 and 2, many in between. Did you know when that happened, that event happened, that that was going to be your path, or was it just kind of like you dabbling and then it just hooked you?
With the astrology or the asteroids?
Well, probably both. I mean,
No, I wasn't. I never set out to become an astrologer. And even once I started doing charts for my friends, it was never in my thought, oh, I'm going to, learn how to set up a practice and become a professional. It was just something that happened. And at a certain point, I saw, hey, I can make like a little bit of money from this. Like, that's not a bad thing. And it wasn't until after Asteroid Goddesses was written, that was published 1986, that all of a sudden I found myself, like, I was a young mom with kids living on the Oregon coast. And all of a sudden it seemed like I was like a professional, credible astrologer because like I had a published book and invitations started coming to present material. So the whole thing sort of took me by surprise how it all just happened rather than it being a planned.
that's really beautiful too. And for anybody that might not know you, a little bit about Demetria is she has been doing astrology for a really long time, since the 70s, as you said. You've written many books. You have lectured and communicated with people all over the world. You just told us just before we started about a couple of trips that you were on to talk about astrology. So this is embedded in your soul. I can I can imagine that this is something really meaningful to you. The Let's talk a little bit about the pre-conference workshop that you're going to do. So you're going to talk about the Hellenistic houses. Can you tell us a little about what inspired you with that?
Right. Well, certainly this is one of the talks that I love personally. So I'm really thrilled to be able to present it at the Cosmic Patterns lecture. There is a perception in our community that Hellenistic and other forms of traditional astrology are overly practical is not right the word, not quite the right word, but mundane. They deal with like mundane life, and they don't carry the rich psychological or spiritual overlays that modern astrology has become part of the signature of modern astrology. And on one level, that is true in that from what we gather when ancient people like would go to an astrologer, it wasn't tell me about the meaning of my life or tell me about my issues with like my mother or my father or why am I have such a hard time in relationships. But it was more, well, will I get married and when will that happen? How many times and will it be good and bad? How's my health? Will I have a long or short life? Will I have children? Um, will I have status in my life? Will I have wealth? And so the kinds of questions that were asked were very practical. And there's the assumption that that was the sum total of the astrology. And certainly the significations of the houses um, were very matter of fact, down to earth topics. But as you go more deeply into the meanings of the houses and through the names that they were given, we see that they incorporated huge swaths of ancient mythology, of ancient philosophy, of ancient religion, and of culture that informed whoever it was that came up with the specific topics that each house represented. So, for example, we know now the third house, we call it communication, okay? And that we may also say, oh, yeah, and in the text, they also say it has to do with siblings, with brothers and sisters. Okay. And then you get, writing out of that, or you get some little bit of short distance travel out of that. Uh, but as we start peeling back the third house, we learned that the name that it was given was the goddess. And it also ruled divination and sacred rituals, and that the planet who had her joy in the third house was the moon. And that was often contrasted with the ninth house. And all of the houses have polar opposites. And even the ancient astrologer said that each opposite house is reflected across the pattern. And the ninth house was called the sun, the house of God. The third house was the goddess. Its joy was the sun. And in mythology, Artemis was the goddess of the moon, and Apollo was the god of the sun. And they were brother sister. They were the twins. And so, right there in the brother sister relationship between the planets that rejoiced in the houses, we have the topic of siblings. Okay, this is how come siblings has been put there. But more than that, as we go into the sun was a principle of divination, and the ninth house ruled astrologers and other prophets because the sun could see everything. It moved across the sky, it saw everything that was going on, so it knew what was happening. So it had that quality, and that became reflected to the moon. And then, so that both the third and house had to do with religious orders, and we see that to the extent that the house of the moon goddess, the third house, may have had to do with women's religion, with worship of the goddess. And in now we call them like monasteries and convents, but of spiritual orders, we call them brothers and sisters, soror and frater, and that in occult societies, right, that's the name that's given to the people that are part of your community. So we see how that brother sister motif shows up in the religious aspect of the third and ninth house that derives from the brother sister relationship of Apollo and Artemis, who are the divine twins. So it's on that level that I begin to unpack the mundane meanings of the houses and begin to show some of the uh, religion, myth, and philosophy that lies underneath them. And then what that means is there are some contemporary astrologers that say, oh, well, if you want a spiritual reading, like, you can't go to traditional astrology. You won't get a spiritual reading from them. Um, but I'm saying, no, if you're a Hellenistic astrologer, you can talk about the ordinary manifestation of the third house as your actual siblings. But I can't tell you how many people I've asked about to what extent they're involved in connections with the goddess, or women's ritual and spirituality, have full third houses, and no one has ever told them that that is also one of the significations of the third house. So we can get into that deeper level through being able to understand the multi-layering of the houses from a Hellenistic perspective.
I don't know, but what house system do you use in Hellenistic astrology, or is it depend on the astrologer?
Well, I have been using the whole sign houses since the
Mm-hmm.
late 1990s, certainly by 2000. Um, that wasn't the only system that is in the text. There's a description of porphyry houses, and there's also a description of equal houses. And so um, the ancient astrologers knew about all three house systems, and that they knew um, that there was a difference between the MC degree, which is the culminating degree, and the nonagestional, which is, you might call it the equal house, 10th house cusp, which is the high point of the ecliptic. And they were aware that these were two different points that they had given the same name to. And one of the recent lectures I did, I sort of teased out the astronomy of each one of them and how by understanding the astronomy, both could be utilized in the chart, but the interpretation was slightly different. So I think that people can, on one hand, we would say, well, use the house system for the kind of astrology you do. So many evolutionary astrologers use porphyry houses. Rudyard used Campanus houses. The Lilly tradition uses Regiomontanus houses. And so, like, use that system. However, where that begins to break down, and of course, I was told when I was a young astrologer, well, use whatever house system your own chart looks the best in. So you might get some of your planets out of like the 12th or the 8th, like just go to your house system and call that good. Um, it's funny. It's true also. I mean, not that your chart will be better in a different house system, but that's what the advice was by. But the but the place where that breaks down is, let's say, for example, in horary astrology, where, you know, will I find my lost keys? Will my cat come back? And depending on the house system you use, different signs will be on the houses that rule the question. And then based on that, you're looking at the connection between different sets of planets. And in one house system, you might have, Venus trine Jupiter. Yes, your cat will come back, absolutely. Or if you use a different house system, it might be like flipped to a Mars Saturn square, which is like probably not. And the reality is either the cat comes back or the cat doesn't come back. So this is where we have some problems with using the system for the kind of astrology you do. I don't know the answer to that, but I know it's one of the biggest problems in astrology. It is one of our Achilles heels. And anyone from outside the tradition wanting to totally undermine astrology, all they have to do is go to the house system controversies, and astrology can be completely unraveled through that. So, as I said, I don't know the answer, but I do know that it is a problem.
Well, and I think too, when we talk about, to undermine the system, it depends on, like, because I agree with that. If you're going from a sort of a scientific basis of physical fact,
Hmm.
you're looking at things in a certain way. And astrology works in a sense beyond just the scientific fact of things, because there is ways you can look at the chart that are not technically correct, but they still are correct, you
That's
know? So,
interesting.
I mean, it just is true. And for me, I mean, I appreciate, sort of the way you're viewing things and the way you're describing stuff, because you're right. It depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you're, if you're looking for the cat, you need to use certain systems. Certain systems don't really work well for that. They don't. But it doesn't mean they don't work, and you sort of like, okay, see what type of astrology. I mean, I will switch it up like constantly. I'm looking at a chart depending on what I need to find, and then compare. And I think you're right when you deal with Hellenistic to say there isn't spirituality. I mean, I love the idea that you're loving the mythology of the stories and taking a lot of the old world. And you're correct in the fact that typically when they were coming to the astrologer, they were looking for something very tangible. But it doesn't mean there isn't mass spirituality in these archetypal stories and in these. It's just you have to, as a person, learn what these things mean. And then you'll pull out of Hellenistic astrology unbelievable spiritual truths.
Right. And that's
You know,
exactly what I'm hoping to do in the workshop on the Hellenistic houses,
that's
is to pull the
awesome.
spiritual truths out of each one of the houses. And they're just, I could actually spend 2 full days teaching that.
Probably longer. So for me,
hours on the workshop, so that is great.
well,
Yeah.
it's wonderful, the idea of science, but science ultimately for human beings, we get bored with it. Stories we don't get bored with, and we remember the stories. That's why mythology is so powerful, because it penetrates in and we remember and we can relate to, and it allows us to enter in. And that's what mythologies are. I mean, for me, they're core with astrology. You can't take the myths out of astrology. If you do, you're gutting the heart.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
you can't do it. It's not a pure science in that way. It needs the story. It needs that texture there to really understand what's happening. So, I mean, I look forward to, again, your talks, because they bring that story in, and you do such a great job of that, of sort of incorporating and allowing people to enter the story, because it's going to make you as an astrologer much better. You're going to see little nuanced things in understanding the story that you're not going to just get from a book or get from a this means this type of thing. So exciting.
It's also very easy to follow Demetra because she's extremely organized and you can easily follow her sequentially.
Yeah.
It's awesome. So
Yeah.
this workshop's gonna be awesome.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that about spirituality too, because the ancient people were spiritual, maybe different. Well, obviously different than we are now in the modern age, but they still had that connection to spirit. So it's interesting how some people have that view on it. But yeah, I'm glad to hear this, because I think this will help to maybe broaden the view of what people think or know about Hellenistic astrology because of your studies and your knowledge in it. So yeah, that's really exciting. Do you have a favorite asteroid?
No, that's like asking
Which kid?
Yeah.
And they, there's almost like a parade of them that over the course of my life has passed in front. And at certain times, someone says, me, like, now I want your attention, and I'll focus and do some work and put it out there and shape and craft a presentation. And then, like, they get bumped over by the next person in line. But
That's understandable.
But I am doing a webinar in a couple of weeks on November 23rd. I was great good fortune to be able to obtain the birth data of 125 contemporary herbalists.
Mm.
Wow.
And I have, out of the list of 28,000 asteroids, I teased out about maybe 30 to 40 that had to do with healing and plant medicine and plant magical medicine. And I have put those asteroids in these charts and was searching for a theme to emerge. And I found it having to do with the major goddess Pallas Athena and Medusa and Asclepius and Hygeia that were all depicted with the serpent, which was an ancient symbol of regeneration and healing and wisdom. And so we pulled those charts out. I developed a summary and questionnaire that I sent out. And now I'm getting the replies. And so the webinar in a few weeks will be both telling those stories about the power of the serpent as a healing energy and seeing how those specific asteroids have manifested in the lived experiences of this community of herbalists. So that's happening November 23rd through Astrology University. So that's part of the asteroid work. So Medusa is one of them. Okay, and here we go. Get into the crazy mystery of how astrology works. And I landed upon her and Athena just because I kept seeing charts where they're prominent. And then I began like developing the teaching and the questions and all of that. And somewhere like a couple of weeks into this project, 2-3 weeks, I said, oh yeah, like where's Medusa in my chart? Like, let me go look it up. And I saw that it's at 26 degrees of Taurus. And I go, wait a second, isn't that where the transit of Uranus is right now? Which it is. And so it's like, okay, my own Medusa was being activated at a time when I was looking at all these charts and that asteroid said, like, look at me, please. It's like, it's my turn for you to look at me. So that's the fascinating mystery about the mutual synchronicity between the sky and our individual psyches and how that happens as part of an integrated whole rather than like a separated cause and response, because both were happening simultaneously. Or was it like my eyes were being, because of my Uranus transit, my eyes were being sensitized to see Medusa appearing before me, whereas like a year ago, the lens on my eyes like didn't see her in the way it's looking at her now. So those are some of the interesting places where the asteroid studies are bringing me.
That's fascinating. And it's so interesting when that happens too, when there's a synchronicity like that, you know, like you just described. Yeah, that's so cool. So, wow, I'm excited. I'm excited for your workshop and your presentation. And
and then my main lecture is Hellenistic planetary condition. And that's like the foundation teaching for all of the Hellenistic material, and understanding through those guidelines how to tell if a planet, by the sort of the conglomerate of its sign, house, aspect, other conditions, how likely it is to enable the person to express that energy in ways that are helpful or not helpful to them. So, for example, Mars may be in the second house, and for beginning astrologers, we go, oh, well, does this mean that you have a lot of energy, dynamic energy to pursue creating wealth? Or does this mean you are overly aggressive in your money matters? Or does it mean you're going to encounter a lot of conflict over money with other people? Like, those are all acceptable interpretations of Mars in the second house. But how does the beginning astrologer know, like, what point on that spectrum any specific individual might end up be most likely to go. And so by knowing whether this Mars is in the sign of its rulership or detriment, if it's combust the sun or retrograde, of the kinds of difficult aspects it may be getting from Mars and Saturn, if it belongs to the sect or in favor or not. By putting all of those together, we have a more grounded basis for which to give our interpretation, whether we're going to be talking about helping them understand the nature of why they encounter conflict over money matters with, their parents, their children, their partner, their whoever, anyone in their life, or to what extent to be encouraged in going full steam ahead in generating wealth and ideas and ways they might have. Because you don't want, and again, this is where the Hellenistic and all forms of traditional astrology bring us into very sensitive ethical questions around being astrologers. Because there's one approach that you never want to tell anything negative to the client. You don't want to say anything disempowering. You don't want to make them feel bad about themselves. You don't want to make them regret that they ever came to you in the first place. But at the same time, you don't want to overinflate their expectations so that you steer them in directions that may not be the best path for them, especially when there are other places in the chart where if they went there, they would be more likely to have more positive outcomes. So the Hellenistic and the base course in interpreting planetary condition, helps you learn how to tread that terrain very carefully.
That's really helpful too, because you're right. You don't know what does that Mars in the second house mean. It could mean a myriad of things. So that's going to be really helpful.
Right.
And
So now you have, based on astrology, you have, 10 or 15 things you can look at that can give you as an astrologer a better idea what's going on. Then the astrologer's counselor has to take that and, spin it before you tell the client. But at least you have a clear idea on the helpful commentary you're making, about commentary that actually is helpful and speaks to the reality of their situation.
So even beginners can attend this workshop and will really learn a lot.
Oh, yes. And, that's it's been one of my specialties in teaching
Yeah.
beginners and how to make complex stuff accessible. It would be great for beginners. That's what my assumption is in a lot of the teachings. How can I do this teaching so that beginners will understand, that advanced people won't be bored?
yeah, there's a little trick there, right? I'm sure you'll do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that'll be great. Do you, being a Hellenistic astrologer, do you use the outer planets or do you
Oh,
leave them
of
out?
course, I use the outer planets, and I use like 500 asteroids.
Yeah, well,
Wow.
that's true too. I didn't even think
Right,
about
right,
that.
right. But I use the Hellenistic to lay the foundation for the chart.
Mm.
Okay.
Hmm.
And then once I understand the foundation, then I can add in the asteroids for the details that you can't get from the foundation. And the outer planets, no one can deny that they have a potent effect, but I don't think that they rule signs.
Hmm.
And, Rudyard called them transpersonal, the ambassadors to the galaxy. And sometimes I think that if, Uranus landed in some country, now our politics is some autocratic country, let's say, and the president of that country or the king or the ruler came up and started telling Uranus the rules of this country, and Uranus would go, "Hey, like I'm from outer space. Like your rules mean nothing to me. Like I'm totally not bound by that." And so I think by having that sense of how the outer planets function beyond the Saturn, beyond the limits of our known, accepted, organized world, and they're there to shake things up and to break those boundaries.
Mhm.
And hence, they don't rule signs, nor are they ruled by planets that are in those signs. They're acting as free agents. Then we can have a slightly different take on how we interpret and integrate them in the chart.
As it's beautiful.
It really is beautiful, and it's exciting to learn. And what you were saying about the foundation, looking at the Hellenistic astrology in the foundation, it's kind of like learning astrology, where it came from. And then if you want to get into the modern stuff, it's kind of this, the same kind of concept, thinking you need to know where you're going, where you were to know where you're going. That's what kind of came to my mind when you were saying that. So it makes a lot of sense that you use it in that manner. And it will be helpful to understand, how we can also work with that in our own chart interpretation.
Exactly. And you don't have to not continue being whatever kind of astrology you are in order to be able to understand some of the earliest thinking on how it is that planets function in different conditions.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. And
For myself, I kind of see astrology, growing up in a very sort of religious background, and there's different denominations. I kind of see astrology in the same way, that there's these different denominations. There's these different ways of viewing a scripture or a text or whatever, and you have to work within that to open people up as well.
Mhm.
To see, because typically people are, each sort of denomination, as it were, has a strength and then they have a weakness.
Mhm.
That's kind of the way it goes. And instead of just demolishing things and saying, you know what, they're wrong, I'm right, it's like, wait a minute, they're actually really good at this point.
Mhm.
Let's use that, and maybe they're not as great on this thing, but this one is, so let's use that too. And yeah, well, I mean, and like your attitude, you'll have some people that don't want to touch the outer planets at all, because that's not a part of that original system. And okay, but you might want
Right.
to
In
use
1930, you had some astrologers that didn't want to touch Pluto because
yeah,
they were doing fine with the 9 planets they already had. So that speaks more to um, I don't want to say what I'm going to say.
well, I mean, it's their framework. It's a framework they're working in. So
Framework.
it's
Yeah,
like,
we shouldn't get too set in our own system as being the ultimate and
yes,
close our mind to anything else that's going on that might expand us. Just
yes,
because we have our system worked out, we have our clients, like we have our income stream, and we don't want to upset the apple cart because we're doing fine the way we are.
yes,
And thereby, like closing up our minds to astrology, which is an ever expanding system of understanding. It's
yes,
just like we are seeing parts of the universe now that 20 years ago we had no idea existed. That cosmos is so much bigger than we can possibly imagine. And our minds are likewise like
yes,
growing in a way to encompass that. And
yes.
so, why shouldn't we, as individual astrologers, be open to expanding our concepts of to something larger than just like my way and the only way to do this?
Yes. Well, and
Yeah.
that's one of the things
I'm sorry for getting up on that soapbox.
well, no, it's one of the things that convergence really this conference is
Yeah,
about. It's about
Yeah.
bringing
it is exactly
different
what this is about.
different practices
Yeah.
coming together to share what you do. It's not about saying this one's better than that, but it's about, hey,
Yeah.
okay, people have ways of doing things, and we want things that work, and let's be open to learn from each other, and not be about, well, no, there's only one right way to do it and there's a wrong. No,
Yeah.
it's if you're good at what you do, then great, share it.
Right.
know?
Yeah, and just being able to see the multiplicity of the ways astrology works, and
Right.
yeah,
Right.
exactly, to celebrate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But for me,
call it a convergence celebration.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Although, yeah, for
go ahead.
me, in 2006, Pluto was demoted into no longer a planet. But to me, it's very powerful. So Pluto is still a planet for me. So,
Me too. Especially since it's on my sun and Midhaven right now. So I'm
yeah.
definitely feeling it's real. It's really affecting me. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Demetra. I'm so excited to see you again at the conference and hear your presentation and your workshop. And yeah, it's been wonderful being able to talk with you as well on the podcast here too.
So I
Thank
look
you so
forward
much.
to you and everyone who's like looking at this. Please come and join in the celebration of astrologers being together and sharing their wisdom. Okay. See you in March. Okay. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
thank
Thank
you.
you.